In the wild Wyoming mountains, a fierce storm traps a lonely woman with a giant, kind-hearted stranger, and what starts as survival turns into something way warmer than any fire. That's the hook that pulls you into this cozy tale of unexpected love. Listen close, friend. She offered herself for shelter from the snow. The giant mountain man said, "You don't owe me that," then covered her with his own coat. The Wyoming mountains. Late winter of 1887. The storm had rolled in before noon, swallowing the peaks and valleys in a wall of white. By dusk, the wind howled through the pines like a wounded animal, hurling sheets of snow against the ridges. Somewhere in that blinding fury, Anna Whitmore stumbled through drifts that reached her knees, her hands numb, her breath ragged. She had been walking for hours, following nothing but the faint outline of a slope until the dark shape of a cabin loomed through the whirling snow. Her knees nearly gave way at the sight. She staggered to the porch, lifted one frozen hand, and pounded on the door. When it swung open, the heat from inside hit her like a blow. The doorway was filled by a man, broad-shouldered, towering, his face shadowed by the brim of a worn hat. Behind him, the orange glow of a fire danced against log walls. Her voice trembled, each word scraping her throat. "I can pay in another way." For a long moment, he did not move. His eyes, gray as the winter sky, held hers, steady and unblinking. Then he spoke, his tone low, deliberate. "Not here, not ever." The words seemed to cut through the roar of the wind. Before she could speak again, he reached for a heavy fur coat hanging on a peg by the door. Stepping forward, he draped it over her shoulders. The weight of it nearly bowed her, but the warmth seeped in instantly, driving back the bite of the cold. "Come inside," he said. She obeyed without thinking, and the door shut behind her with a thud that sealed out the storm. The cabin smelled of pine and wood smoke. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, casting flickers of light over a sturdy table, shelves lined with tools and jars, and a bed tucked against the far wall. She turned toward him, still clutching the coat around her. Her clothes were thin, a worn dress, stockings damp with melted snow, boots scuffed from miles of rough ground. Her lips were pale, almost blue, and her eyes carried the restless mix of shame and exhaustion. The man was like no one she had met before. He was easily a head taller than most men she'd known, his frame built like the pines outside, solid, immovable. His hands were large, the skin weathered and nicked from work, yet every movement was measured, careful, as though afraid to cause harm. Without a word, he guided her toward the fire, pulling a chair closer so the heat could reach her. He crouched by the hearth, adding another log, the muscles in his back shifting beneath his flannel shirt. "You're frozen through," he said, glancing at her over his shoulder. "Sit. Warm yourself." She lowered herself into the chair, the fur coat pooling around her like a blanket. The heat licked at her face and hands, and for the first time in hours, she felt something other than the raw ache of cold. He rose to his full height, filling the space between her and the door. And for a moment, she wondered if she had stepped into safety or simply into another kind of danger. But he only crossed to a shelf, fetched a tin cup, and poured steaming water from a kettle that had been hanging over the fire. "Drink," he said, setting it on the small table beside her. The steam curled into her face, carrying the scent of pine needles. She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat soak into her fingers before taking a slow sip. Outside, the wind battered the cabin walls, a deep, steady thrum that seemed to rattle through the logs. The man moved about the room, checking the shutters, tossing a wool blanket over the bed. Each task done with quiet efficiency. She tried to speak, to ask his name, to explain how she had come to be alone in this wilderness, but the words tangled in her throat. He didn't press her. Instead, he returned. To the hearth, poked the fire until the flames leapt higher, and settled into the chair opposite hers. His gaze was calm, unreadable, but not unkind. For a time they sat in silence. The only sounds the hiss of the logs, the muffled roar of the storm, and her own breathing as it began to slow. The warmth seeped deeper, loosening the knot of tension in her shoulders. He pulled the fur coat tighter around herself, its weight a strange comfort. She didn't know this man, didn't know why he had let her in without demanding payment or explanation, but the truth settled over her as firmly as the coat on her back. She was safe, at least for tonight. The storm would rage until morning. The wind would scream and claw at the cabin walls. But here, in the glow of the fire, with the scent of woods, smoke curling through the air and the quiet presence of the man across from her, Anna Whitmore felt something she had not felt in a long, long time. She felt secure, and that more than the warmth or the coat was what kept her still in her chair long after her hands had stopped shaking. The storm eased by morning, leaving the mountains wrapped in a muffled stillness. Outside, the snow lay deep and clean, the trees bowed under its weight. Inside the cabin, the air was warm from the fire Caleb had kept through the night, though the flames had dwindled to a low, glowing bed of coals. Anna stirred in the chair where she'd drifted to sleep. The heavy fur coat still rested around her shoulders, smelling faintly of smoke and pine. Caleb was already moving about the room, his steps steady and unhurried. "You should learn how to keep the fire going," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. "If I'm outside and you need heat, you'll know what to do." He straightened in the chair, brushing her hair from her face. I have never done that before. That's all right." He crossed to the wood pile by the wall, selecting a few split logs. "It's not difficult, just takes patience." The hearth was a tidy corner of the cabin, its stones blackened with years of use. Caleb knelt beside it, setting the logs on the floor. "First you clear the ashes just enough to let air through," he explained, scraping gently at the coals with a small poker. "Then you lay kindling thin pieces, first. The fire needs to breathe." Anna crouched beside him, the warmth of the coals brushing her cheeks. She reached for a piece of kindling, but her fingers hesitated. Caleb handed her one, their hands not quite touching. "Here," he said. She placed it awkwardly atop the coals. The flame caught briefly, then sputtered out. Her mouth tightened. "I did it wrong." "No," he said evenly. "You just need to adjust." He pointed to the space between the sticks. "Give the fire a way through." She tried again. This time the flame licked at the wood, but when she reached for another piece, her sleeve brushed the stack and sent it tumbling. The fire died in an instant. "I am hopeless," she muttered. "You're learning," Caleb replied. He picked up the scattered sticks, setting them back in place. "Here, let me guide your hand." He paused before touching her wrist. "May I?" She glanced at him, caught off guard by the question, and nodded. His fingers were warm, surprisingly gentle as he adjusted the angle of her hand. "Hold it steady," he murmured. Together they set the kindling, then added a small log. Caleb struck a match, shielding it from the draft, and nodded for her to light the edge. This time the flame caught and grew, curling upward in bright ribbons. Faste. Warmth began to spread. A small, unexpected thrill lit in her chest. "It's working." "It is," he said. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. She sat back on her heels, watching the fire take hold, the orange glow flickering in her eyes. The cabin around them was simple, but well kept. The air carried the clean scent of pine from the logs that made up the walls. A handmade table sat near the window, its surface smoothed by years of use. Two chairs, mismatched but sturdy, flanked it. Shelves held jars of dried beans, strips of smoked meat, and a few well-worn books. Everything had a place, and nothing was left to clutter. "You keep this place. Very orderly," she said. "It has to be," he replied. "A winter like this, if you can't find what you need, it might as well be gone." She nodded, tracing the grain of the wood floor with her gaze. "I was traveling with others," she began slowly. "We were headed west, but I got separated." Caleb didn't press for details. He simply added another log to the fire. "The mountain doesn't care about plans," he said. "It will take you if you're not careful. Sometimes even if you are." She studied him, sensing something behind. The words, something he wasn't telling her. "And yet you stay here. It's home," he said simply. "And I know how to live here. You keep your fire, you keep your stores, and you keep your head when the weather turns." She looked back at the flames, thinking of how easily they had died when she made a mistake, and how quickly they had burned. When he guided her, the fire popped softly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Caleb leaned back on his heels, studying her face in the flickering light. "You did well," he said. She met his gaze, and for a heartbeat, the warmth in the room seemed to come as much from that rare, quiet smile as from the hearth. The morning broke crisp and bright, the kind of winter day that fooled you into thinking it was gentle. Sunlight spilled through the pines in sharp beams, making the snow glitter as though the whole forest were made of glass. Caleb handed Anna a pair of thick mittens and a scarf from the peg by the door. "We'll get more firewood before the clouds roll in," he said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if this were nothing more than another task in a long winter's routine. Anna hesitated, glancing toward the safety of the hearth, but she pulled the scarf over her head and followed him outside. The air bit at her cheeks immediately. Snow crunched underfoot, deep enough that every step demanded effort. Caleb led the way along a narrow path, breaking through the crust, so her steps would be easier. He carried the axe over one shoulder, its blade glinting in the pale sun. The forest was quieter than she expected. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, only the faint whisper of wind high in the treetops and the muted thud of their boots. They reached a stand of spruce where fallen branches lay half buried in snowdrifts. Caleb set down the axe and knelt, showing her how to pull free the driest pieces, how to test the weight and sound of the wood before adding it to the sled. She mimicked his motions, clumsy at first, but the work warmed her fingers and steadied her breath. It was when she stepped toward a thicker branch farther upslope that she heard it, an unfamiliar sound, sharp and delicate at once. Her head snapped up. A thin veil of snow shifted on the slope above, then began to slither downward, slow at first, then faster, gathering mass and speed. "Anna." Caleb's voice was suddenly urgent. Before she could move, her boots slid on the icy crust. The world tilted. She felt her feet go out from under her, the weight of snow pulling at her legs. Panic flashed hot in her chest. Then, he was there. Caleb's arm hooked firmly around her waist, yanking her clear of the path of the slide. The force of it spun her toward him, and he turned with the movement, putting his back to the rushing snow. It hit with a muffled roar, slamming against his shoulders and spilling around them in a cold, choking spray. Anna pressed against him instinctively, her hands clutching at the coarse wool of his coat. She could hear his breathing, steady but quickened, matching the hammering of her own heart. "It's all right," he said, his voice low, almost lost under the hiss of settling snow. "I've got you." They stood like that for what felt like a long time, her cheek against his chest, the heat of him seeping into her bones. His arm stayed strong around her, his other hand braced against the trunk of a nearby tree. Gradually, the tension in her muscles eased. The trembling that had started in her legs faded until she was aware of only the cold air on her face and the thud of his heartbeat under her ear. When he finally stepped back, it was slow, deliberate, as if making sure she could stand steady on her own. His gaze searched her face for any sign of hurt. "You're not hurt." She shook her head, still breathless. "No, I'm fine." "Good." He glanced at the slope, now marked by a fresh scar of disturbed snow. "Well, keep to the lower ground from here." They gathered the last of the wood in silence. Anna kept close, her eyes on the trail he made through the drifts. Each time he turned to check on her, something unspoken passed between them. A quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened, of the way his presence had stood between her and something much colder than the snow. By the time the cabin came into view, the light had shifted, shadows stretching long over the white ground. Caleb pulled the sled to the woodpile and began, stacking the logs without a word. Anna lingered by the door, watching him. The air between them felt different now, not heavier, but fuller, threaded with something that didn't need to be named. She thought of the moment his arms had closed around her, not as a cage, but as a shelter. Inside, as they shed, their snow-crusted coats. She met his eyes for a heartbeat longer than before. He didn't smile, not exactly, but the smallest easing of his features told her he understood. That night, the wind returned, rattling at the cabin walls, but Anna lay, in her bedroll, feeling the echo of his steady grip in the storm, and though no words had been promised, she knew there was a new tether between them, something as quiet as the snow outside, and just as certain. The snow had been falling all morning, soft and steady, blurring the outlines of the pines beyond the cabin window. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the faint aroma of wood smoke and dried herbs from the small bundle hanging near the stove. Caleb had gone out to check his traps, leaving Anna with the quiet of the cabin. She decided to make herself useful, moving to the tall wooden cupboard beside the hearth. The shelves inside were neat but crowded. Folded wool blankets, stacks of clean shirts, a row of jars sealed with wax. She began to refold a pile of linens when her hand brushed against something tucked at the back of the shelf. She pulled it out carefully. It was a scarf, soft once, perhaps, but now worn thin, its deep blue faded to a dusty gray. The edges were frayed, and a small tear had been mended with uneven stitches. It looked like it had been folded and refolded 100 times, yet kept close enough to gather the faint scent of cedar from the cupboard. Anna's fingers lingered on the knit pattern. It was clearly handmade, each loop and stitch imperfect in a way that made it personal. She was still holding it when the door opened, and a gust of cold swept in with Caleb. He stepped inside, shutting out the snow, stamping the frost from his boots. His gaze fell on the scarf in her hands, and something in his expression shifted. The easy steadiness she'd come to know gave way to a darker stillness, his eyes fixed on the fabric. "I didn't mean to pry," she said quickly. "I was just, it's all right," he cut in, though his voice was quieter than usual. He set his gloves on the table, then walked over and took the scarf from her gently, as if it might fall apart in his hands. "She made this," he said after a pause. "Oh, my sister Ruth." He ran a thumb over the frayed edge. "She was younger than me. Too young to be alone in a storm that size." Anna said nothing, letting the words come in their own time. "I was 2 days out on the North Ridge hunting before the big freeze. The snow came in fast, faster than it should have." His jaw tightened. "By the time I made it back, the cabin roof had half caved in. She'd tried to make it to the neighbor's place, but they found her the next morning, not far from the tree-ine." He stopped, the firelight catching in the rough lines of his face. The scarf hung loosely from his hands, a fragile thread between past and present. I've kept it ever since, he went on. It's the only thing of hers that the snow didn't take. Anna felt a hollow ache in her chest. She had seen loss before, had carried her own version of it. But the quiet, unyielding way he spoke told her this was more than grief. It was a wound that had shaped the way he stood in the world, the way he kept his distance, the way he guarded what little he had left. You blame yourself, she said softly. I was supposed to be there. His voice was low, almost flat. I was supposed to keep her safe. Anna's eyes dropped to the scarf, imagining a young girl's laughter caught in the loops of yarn, the warmth of her hands as she had worked each stitch. Sometimes we can't be everywhere, she said. Sometimes the storm is faster. He looked at her then, and in his gaze she saw not just the weight he carried, but the recognition of something in her, something equally heavy. She thought of the nights she'd spent making choices she couldn't take back, of the cold calculations she had endured to survive, of the faces she couldn't forget. Loss had many shapes. His was carved in snow and silence, hers in shadows and bargains made under duress, but both left the same hollow behind. The fire cracked softly, filling the space between them. Caleb folded the scarf carefully, setting it back in the cupboard with a precision that felt almost like a ritual. Ruth would have liked you, he said finally. Anna wasn't sure what to say to that, so she just nodded, feeling the truth of it settle somewhere deep. In that moment, the cabin seemed smaller, the snow outside quieter, as if the world itself was holding still for the weight of what had been shared. The wind rose without warning, a low moan at first, then a full-throated howl that rattled the shutters and sent snow driving against the cabin walls like thrown gravel. Anna woke to the sound of it sitting up on her narrow bed in the corner. The air inside was colder than it had been when she'd gone to sleep, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to little more than embers. Caleb was already moving, pulling on his coat, checking the latch on the door. Storm's coming in fast, he said over the roar outside, faster than I've seen in years. The wind hit the cabin broadside, making the walls groan. Snow sifted in through the tiny gap under the door. Caleb crossed the room in 2 strides and threw another log on the fire, coaxing the flames higher. Then came a sharp, splintering crack from above. Anna's head jerked up just as a heavy roof beam, loosened by the shaking, broke free and dropped toward her. Anna. Caleb was across the room before she could move. He threw, himself between her and the falling timber, his broad shoulders taking the brunt of the impact. The beam slammed into him with a sickening thud before hitting the floor beside them. She gasped, reaching for him. "Caleb, I'm fine," he said through clenched teeth. But his hand went instinctively to his left shoulder, fingers curling tight against the pane. Outside, the wind shrieked louder, as if trying to tear the roof clean away. Caleb forced himself to. His feet grabbed the fallen beam and braced it back into place with a length of wood from the corner. Snow swirled down from the damaged roof, dusting his hair and shoulders. The cabin shuddered again, but the roof held. Caleb leaned against the wall for a moment, breathing hard before looking at her. "We'll be all right now." She didn't believe him, not with the way his jaw tightened against the pain. But she nodded, pushing past the pounding of her own heartbeat. "Sit down," she said firmly. He started to protest. "Anna, there's no sit down." Her tone beaked no argument, and after a moment, he lowered himself onto the bench by the fire. She fetched the small wooden box of supplies from the shelf, the same one he had used for her knee days before. Up close, she could see the damage. The heavy fabric of his coat torn at the shoulder, the shirt beneath darkened with blood. Her hands trembled as she worked the buttons open, revealing the bruising already blooming beneath his skin. "Hold still," she murmured, though he hadn't moved. The gash was long but shallow, cut more by the splintered edge of the beam than by blunt force. She cleaned it with warm water, the heat of the cloth sending little curls of steam into the cold air. He didn't flinch, but his eyes stayed on her face, watching every movement. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Her throat tightened. "I've taken care of people." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. She spread a thin layer of salve across the wound, then bound it with a strip of clean linen, pulling the knot snug. Her fingers brushed the warm skin of his back, and she realized she was holding her breath. When it was done, she stepped back, flexing her cold, stiffened hands. "That should hold until the storm passes." He glanced at the bandage, then up at her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "Thank you." The wind battered the walls again, making the small window tremble in its frame. Anna tossed another log onto the fire, the flames jumping high enough to cast long shadows across the cabin. Caleb shifted, testing the movement of his shoulder. "You should get some rest," he said. She shook her head. "I'll stay up a while. Someone should watch the roof." They sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. Now and then the cabin creaked, but the patched beam held. Anna's eyes kept drifting to the curve of his shoulders in the firelight, the way his presence seemed to anchor the small room against the fury beyond its walls. The storm would pass. Storms always did. But she knew she would remember the moment he had thrown himself into harm's way without a thought. That instinct, that absolute refusal to let the world touch her if he could stop it, had carved something permanent into her chest. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire burned steady, and Caleb sat close enough that she could hear the rhythm of his breathing. Each won a quiet promise against the dark. The storm had blown itself out by morning, leaving the world buried under a deep, glittering blanket of snow. The air outside was sharp and clean, so still that every branch sagged heavy with white. Inside the cabin, the air felt warmer somehow, not just from the fire, but from the fact that they had weathered the night together. Anna woke to find Caleb already moving around, rolling the fallen beam to one side, sweeping away the last dusting of snow from the floor. She joined him without a word, gathering scattered kindling and writing. A chair that had tipped in the chaos. "You don't have to," he began. "I want to," she said simply, brushing wood shavings from her palms. They worked in an easy rhythm, moving furniture back into place, folding blankets, and restocking the wood pile. Now and then their hands brushed, and each time Caleb's gaze flicked to her face as if weighing whether to speak. He didn't, but something softer had settled in the set of his shoulders. By midday, the cabin looked much as it had before the storm, though the patched beam overhead would always remind her of the moment he had thrown himself between her and danger. Over. The next days, the snow outside stayed deep, keeping them close to the hearth. Anna found herself laughing more, the sound surprising even her. Caleb, for his part, spoke more than he had in all the time she had known him, telling her small stories about hunting trips, the stubborn mule he once tried to break, or the way the mountain changed with each season. One afternoon, when they divided up the cooked venison for supper, she noticed him placing the larger portion in her bowl without comment. When she opened her mouth to protest, he just said, "You need it more," and turned back to the pot. Another morning, as they stepped outside to fetch water, he reached over without thinking and adjusted the scarf at her throat, tucking it more securely against the wind. His gloved fingers were quick and sure, and though he said nothing, the gesture lingered with her all day. In the evenings, they often ended up side by side on the bench before the fire, the silence between them no longer taut with weariness, but filled with an unspoken ease. One such night, the wind rattled faintly at the shutters. But the worst of winter's temper was behind them. Caleb sat with his elbows resting on his knees, staring into the flames. "If I ever left the mountains," he said slowly, "I'd build something down in the valley. a place with wide windows so the light could reach every corner, a porch to sit on when the air turned soft in spring. She watched him, the firelight picking out the lines of his face. "You think you'll leave someday?" He shrugged, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Maybe, or maybe. I'd just like to think about it when the snow's too deep to walk 10 steps without sinking to your knees." She smiled back, though she didn't look away. "I think you'd make it a good place." For a moment his eyes met hers, steady and searching. The look held longer than any they'd shared before, the silence stretching into something warm and certain. Anna felt it in the slowing of her own breath, in the way the world outside seemed far away. The fire cracked softly, casting shadows on the walls, and she knew, without either of them saying it, that the distance between them had grown smaller, and the warmth was no longer just from the flames. The sun dipped low over the snowbound peaks, casting the valley in amber and rose. Long shadows reached from the pines, the air holding that still crystalline quiet only found after a storm. Caleb and Anna crossed the yard toward the corral, their breath ghosting in the chill. The horses nickered, coats gleaming in the fading light. Caleb carried a sack of grain over one shoulder, boots crunching in the snow. Anna followed with a bundle of hay in her gloved hands. They worked in silence, hay rustling, the geeling chewing, hooves shifting in straw. When the last bin was filled, Caleb leaned on the fence, watching the sun sink behind the ridge. The light softened the rough lines of his face. Anna joined him, tucking a loose strand of hair from her cheek. For a while neither spoke. The hush of evening wrapped around them, broken only by a lone bird's call. Caleb's gaze turned to her, his eyes steady. "May I kiss you?" The words were quiet but carried everything unspoken between them. Anna's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the rare ache of being truly seen. She had known touch without choice, the coldness of being a transaction. This was different. This wasn't asking. She met his gaze, smiling. "Yes." He stepped closer, slow enough for her to feel his warmth through their coats. One work-rovened hand brushed her arm before resting above her elbow, the other steady at her side. When his lips met hers, there was no haste, only a quiet meeting that spoke of care, not claim. His breath was warm in the cold, carrying the scent of pine and woods. The world faded to the slow press of his mouth and the steady beat of her heart. She leaned into him because she wanted to. The cold nipped at her cheeks, but he was a shelter against it, steady as the mountains. When they parted, their foreheads rested together, breaths mingling in the fading light. "I never thought," Caleb began, then stopped. "Neither did I," she whispered. "But here we are." They stood like that until the last streak of sunlight bled into twilight. Then, without speaking, they walked toward the cabin, steps falling into the same quiet rhythm they had shared since the storm. Snow crunched underfoot. The scent of chimney smoke reached them before the cabin came into view. Inside, the fire would be low, the walls still holding the day's warmth. But out here, peace felt just as deep. Anna glanced at him as they neared the door, the steady set of his shoulders, the quiet in his eyes. It felt like something she could trust, not just tonight, but for whatever came after. At the threshold, he stepped aside as always. She crossed into the glow of the hearth and turned back in time to see him look toward the mountains before following her in. Life in the West would never be. Easy storms would return, winters would bite, and the land would always demand respect. But she knew she was no longer alone in it. As firelight flickered and night settled around them, Anna's heart felt lighter than it had in years. Caleb Hole, the man who had refused to take what wasn't freely given, had given her the one thing she thought lost forever: choice. And in choosing each other, they had built something as enduring as the peaks outside. In the heart of the unforgiving West, he had kept the one promise that mattered most, the silent vow of a heart that knew how to wait. Out here in the wild, where winters bite hard and storms test every inch of a person's strength, love isn't found in grand gestures or easy roads. It's built one quiet choice at a time. If Caleb and Anna's story warmed your heart and reminded you that even in the harshest places, gentleness can still take root, there are more tales like this waiting for you. Subscribe to Legends of the Wild West stories and ride with us through more sweeping romances, rugged landscapes, and unforgettable moments where the human spirit meets. The Untamed Frontier. Your next favorite love story is just over the horizon.